We're speaking with Bruce Pascoe on The Year That Made Me. And Bruce, we've heard about your writing and your work. Your own family history, of course, ended up becoming a bit of a front in the culture war that was born of the success of Dark Emu. But I wonder if you could tell us a bit about your experience of your own family growing up, your understanding of it then, and how that's changed over time.
Oh, well, I was just, like most people, I think, fascinated by the family history, the photo albums, and I really loved my family. I thought there was an enormous amount of strength in our family, not a lot of money, but enormous amount of strength and decency, really. And so I wanted to find out where they'd come from. And there was a lot of knowledge about the grandparent generation, but nothing before that, or so it seemed.
And you had particularly strong relationships with your grandmothers, is that right?
Yeah, well, both my grandmothers were very strong people, and the two families were kind of matriarchal in many ways, and my aunts on both sides were incredibly strong, vibrant people. So I was deeply influenced by that. But I was just curious. I was a reader, and I was curious about the family and started asking questions, and that led me to the library and family archives, and eventually I was finding out stuff that no one wanted to talk about very much, apart from one uncle who knew quite a lot. I was drawn to him, and he spent a lot of time with me just talking through the history.
So what was that history? What was the stuff that people didn't want to talk about, Bruce?
We had Aboriginal family in Tasmania, and even that was complicated because it was related to the fishing families of Tasmania on the north coast prior to Governor Arthur in Hobart. So there's not a lot of written record about that, but there's enough that you can follow it. And so I was able to follow my family in their travels between Launceston, Adelaide and Melbourne and back again. They travelled incessantly, and I couldn't understand that, why they would suddenly seem to have good jobs in Launceston and then be gone again and turn up in Adelaide and later Melbourne. And it was just a repetitious behaviour. And then I began investigating my mother's family and found it even more extreme because that family were related to the great boxing families of Australia and that tradition of tent boxing. And for a kid, that was just fascinating.
Yeah, and I suppose you were there coming up against the challenge of sort of marrying the traditional narrative of the family history with some of the gaps and things that weren't spoken about at the time, and trying to turn that into a coherent story. So how do you look at it now? What's your understanding of it now?
Well, I can understand my parents. In fact, I'm pretty sure my mother knew almost nothing about that side of the family. My grandmother was an orphan, and so she probably brought very little family knowledge with her. My father, I think, probably knew more than he let on. When I was beginning to investigate that family history, he was inclined to support me, and I thought I was going to find a brick wall of defiance, but in fact it was the reverse, and Dad was very friendly. We drew together. It was the Vietnam War times, and my father and I were on the wrong side of that argument. There'd been some difficult years in our relationship, but this search for family did bring us together, and he happened to love my wife. That also helped a lot. And then when Jack, our son, was born, Dad was besotted, so there was a kind of reunion between us. But the important thing for me was the search, because in a way it shocked me out of my intellectual torpor to realise that I had assumed and so much and accepted even more. And as a result, as one of the old aunts said to me, you know nothing about your country. You know nothing about your history. And if you stay as ignorant as that, we can't talk to you. And it was a great incentive. And it was that moment when I realised that I was going to have to do something about refurbishing my own brain that I developed a search for this knowledge. And it put me in a position which I think is unusual, in that I had to search out the intricacies of Australian history, and I had to accept what I found. And I think that put me in an unusual position. And it wasn't a position designed by the magnificence of my own brain, but simply by circumstance.
And perhaps a position that meant that you were going through things a little bit earlier than many others in the rest of the country were. And I suppose that leads us to the year that, no surprise, Bruce Pascoe, you've chosen as the year that made you, 2014. That's the year that Dark Emu came out. A book that was a spectacular success, but that I suppose in some ways also became a mixed blessing. We can talk about what followed in a bit, but for now, Bruce, could you just tell us about your 2014? How did things look back then?
Well, it's a bit of a blur because it was such a dramatic year and I was travelling so much, sort of relentless travel around the country and overseas as a result of the book. So I was in such a whirlwind of activity that the year remains a blur, except I can still feel the wounds of it in that memory of being inside that vortex. It was pretty remarkable, given that I'm a country person and live incredibly remotely and prefer birds to humans.
Yeah, it was a real maelstrom, and it's one that's really continued ever since. What's your perspective on the book and the saga in 2024, Bruce?
Well, I guess I was expecting a backlash because I was taken up by the excitement of a lot of academics in the country about these ideas that I was discovering in the explorers' journals and the journals of first entries into country. But the enthusiasm of a lot of Australians and their quest for knowledge, their thirst for it, was inspiring. And I knew the book was going to be successful simply because of that enthusiasm. Because I'd talk to people about these ideas and they'd want to know more and more. And it was overwhelmingly positive. But I knew that there was a rump of people in Australia who couldn't tolerate the idea of any kind of Aboriginal excellence, because that would call into question the whole invasion of Australia and a revision of the history. And I wasn't revising the history. I was just pointing people to the history. And, there's an extensive bibliography in the book, and it's there for that reason, so that people could go back and read those books for themselves. And if you read the journals of Charles Sturt and Thomas Mitchell, and you will find in there things that are incredibly dramatic, incredibly important. But as most people realise, they never learnt about them in school. And if Thomas Mitchell rides through 9 miles of stooked grain or ricked grain, and Charles Sturt is saved by people who offer him roast duck and cake, they're dramatic things. Any child, any 8-year-old you talk to is fascinated by that stuff, because they're interested in the fact that Charles Sturt was nearly dead from scurvy and all of those things, and then dramatically is brought in by Aboriginal people and fed and clothed and warmed up with a fire and revived. It's a great story, and it's the kind of story that should have made the boys' own journal. But in Australia, we've suppressed all of that knowledge in our history, and that's why a lot of archaeologists, a lot of historians are very passionately in support of Dark Emu. It might seem the other way around. It's a bit like The Voice. It might have seemed, during The Voice, it seemed like everyone was voting no. But in fact, a large number of people voted yes. But the media wasn't reflecting that. And I don't think our education reflects what was actually happening in our history.
So it sounds like, Bruce, you had a sense that the book was going to make an impact, and that there was going to be a backlash. So in a sense, you were prepared, but can you really be prepared for the intensity and the longevity of a cultural phenomenon like Dark Emu?
No, because I knew there'd be a backlash, but I thought it was going to be like an academic argument, you can't call that a house sort of thing. And I had my argument ready to say, well, it wasn't a house like a European house, but it was still a place where people ate and slept. So what else would you call it? That was going to be my argument, and still is. But in fact, the attack was really nasty and full of vitriol and error. People were picking on bits of Dark Emu in error, quoting things that I actually didn't say. But then, of course, they were attacking my family, and that became very hurtful and upsetting because I've got kids, I've got grandkids. My grandkids go to school. And so all of those, headline slurs in the Herald Sun and other Murdoch papers we're obviously getting through to the family. We keep on getting urged to sue, You've got to sue for that, you'll get bloody millions out of that. But these people have been sued before and lost, and it hasn't changed their behaviour in even one little way. And I think the defeat of the referendum has emboldened the far right. And so the wise heads in my family, cousins and sons and people I'm close to, they said, calm down, Dad, pull your head in. We've got work to do. And that's exactly right. There's really important work to do. So to turn around and try and offer reason to these critics would be just a waste of breath, because they actually don't want an explanation. All they want is a target.
Yeah, I've been known to observe there's no point trying to placate your implacable critics. Well, Bruce, it's been a great pleasure speaking with you for the year that made me. Thanks very much for telling us your story.
Well, it's a pleasure to be able to talk about these things on ABC Radio.
And we always